Welcome to the second in our 2020 Planet Forward virtual summit series. I'm Frank Sesno, and I started Planet Forward at the George Washington University more than a decade ago to engage students and innovators, to learn and to tell the stories that move the planet forward. It's become something of a movement, and I'm delighted to welcome you from across the country, students, faculty, schools, scientists, experts, media leaders, to this virtual summit, and this year from my home here in Washington, D.C. With all the upheaval in our world, climate change, race, pandemic, politics, our focus in this summit series is timely and urgent: environmental justice, inclusion, and institutional change. Today, a hard look at the hard work of change. We'll hear from institutional leaders who are taking it on, and student storytellers who are putting it out there. At this moment of reckoning and decision, these stories have real impact. Now, in the second hour, you can choose from 3 breakout sessions that will help you tell your story with more impact. A video storytelling workshop presented by Adobe, how to advocate for a plastic-free campus by those who've done it, and driving change through visual storytelling. That breakout presented by One Tree Planted, our newest partner. They're planting 1 tree for each and every one of you here today and joining us over this 3-part summit series. Trees planted in California to help reforest areas devastated by wildfires in recent years. So invite your friends, plant more trees. Speaking of partners, here's to our sponsors: Lindblad Expeditions, Discovery, Comcast, the Walton Family Foundation, National Geographic, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, 3 Degrees, National Council for Science and the Environment, Island Press, One Tree Planted, Mrs. Green's World, the GW School of Media and Public Affairs, our Advisory Council, and the GW Office of Sustainability. Welcome to our pillar schools: Arizona State University, Middlebury, University of Arkansas, University of Arizona, GW, and welcome our Planet Forward Consortium schools. Now to our keynote conversation. From the time she was a young girl, she broke through barriers and set high expectations. First in her family to graduate from college, Vanderbilt, thanks to the Posse Foundation. First Posse Scholar to earn a PhD in clinical psychology. She became Dean of the College at Middlebury, then Executive Vice Chancellor and CEO at Rutgers. Now, Shirley Collado is President of Ithaca College, where she is making inclusion and innovation a way of life. It's worth noting, by the way, that Shirley's parents are immigrant stories. They came to New York from the Dominican Republic. Her father drove a cab. Her mom worked in a garment factory. Shirley helped take care of her younger brothers. President Collado is passionate about change, environmental equity, and the stories that help make them happen. President Collado, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Frank. It's an honor to be here.
Well, it's an honor for us to have you. So let's just dive in. As a college president, as a woman of color in this year of racial reckoning, in this year of climate crisis and record fires and heat and extreme weather, as an advocate of deep institutional change, how do you see the issue of environmental equity and climate justice coming together with institutional change?
You just listed, Frank, the incredible storm that's happening right now in our nation and around the world. And so it's urgent. I see it as deeply needed for our shared humanity, for us to all collectively work across sectors. And institutionally, I think that this moment demands that we not think of ourselves as individuals and individual institutions, that this has to be about a collective set of actions that we're all committed to for the future of our planet and the people from all walks of life participating in what we're doing.
And when you talk about institutional change, what exactly are you referring to? What do you mean? What do you mean by that?
You know, for me, transformation, change, whether we're talking about higher ed or the private sector or a variety of industries, it's about healthy disruption. It's about not settling for the status quo and really looking in the mirror and being willing to ask hard questions about what this time, and especially what students are asking us, what young people are asking us to pay attention to right now. And in the looking in the mirror, you have to be willing to pivot and really change, to evolve.
Why, to you, does diversity and inclusion matter so much in this conversation about climate change, sustainability?
I don't know, Frank, how it could not be part of the conversation. And I think when we look at the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement and what people are demanding around climate justice, not just climate change, and when we think about the sustainability of not just our planet, but people being able, and especially with the multiple pandemics going on, it's urgent and it's important because it needs to be integrated and core, just as core as everything else that we've been talking about, really centrally placed in a way so that we're all involved and that the outcomes and solutions are actually better as a result of us demanding of ourselves that we really address equity, not just inclusion and being nice and allowing people to come in, not just diversity, where we think about difference of all types, but really about equity and building community and what Susan Sturm at Columbia University calls full participation.
So what at Ithaca, what have you done with respect to environmental equity to change the institution and to make this a more fulsome experience and discussion?
There's so much that I can share, but I'll highlight a couple of things. One, I should fully give tremendous respect to previous leaders at Ithaca before I arrived. I arrived at an institution that already in its DNA was deeply committed to issues of sustainability. And one major thing that's pretty interesting for us that gets at the issue of equity and community, because we happen to be in beautiful Ithaca, New York, where activism is vibrant and civic engagement is part of what this place is about. And I'm very proud of inheriting that, is we're developing a Center for Climate Justice that really has stemmed from faculty across disciplines, just like what Planet Forward is doing with students from all disciplines coming together and really addressing climate justice issues in real time. This here in Ithaca includes community stakeholders, not just us being a college on a hill. The other thing that people may not see as a sustainability initiative, but I do, I see it very related to what you're covering in this incredible gathering. And that is, we have a proposal that's incredibly ambitious from faculty that's focused on race, power, and resistance.
Meaning what?
In across disciplines. So it's actually interdisciplinary, completely in the spirit of what Planet Forward is doing, but looking at race, power, and resistance, social movements, whether you're looking at it from a humanist perspective or a social scientist perspective, and it's inevitable that when you're talking about race and power and resistance in America, issues of climate justice need to be integrated into those themes.
Not unlike higher education, the environmental movement has been seen as white, elitist, restrictive.
Yep.
There's huge pressure for that to change. Thinking of that as an institution, what needs to happen to really open it up and try to do some of the things in the environmental and sustainability and climate change movement that you're talking about doing right on your own campus?
I think everyone involved in this topic should actually own that it is an institution, and it has been. It's an institution that hasn't been having all the best thinkers and people with varied stories at the table. And I think the rise of what we're seeing on college campuses, in streets, in major cities around this country, is asking us and telling us you can't no longer operate this way. When we look at the demand for addressing huge, monumental decisions around climate change, and we're certainly facing a big one around this pandemic, right? You really have to address the very people who are heavily impacted by this. And it's not just wealthy suburban white communities that are thinking about this. So I think one of the things too to mention, Frank, is when you start kind of redefining who the experts are, who gets to be a scholar, who gets to be a contributor, who's valuable in the conversation. And especially institutions of higher ed, we are constantly, I think, flawed in our nature of thinking that we're going to go into a community, study it, and just know that we're the expert. Well, when you kind of just take that veil off and say, I'm going to meet people where they are so I can get educated too, that changes everything. And I think that needs to happen.
So certainly the students and others who are part of this conference and part of this conversation know that through the stories they do and the experience they have with this issue, whether it's extreme weather, whether it's sea level rise, whether it's food insecurity, whether it's vulnerability to hurricanes, heat, right? These things affect lower income people, indigenous people, and people of color disproportionately. That those stories need to be told. That conversation needs to be expanded, just as you say, and that's part of the assignment. But I guess my question to you is, what does it take to expand that conversation, right? To bring these people in you're talking about. And who gets to tell that story?
Your final point about who gets to tell the story, I think, is the most powerful one around our responsibility. So, first, you have to really meet people where they are and have access and knowledge to a community and not go in and just think you're the one with the agenda and you know this community. I think understanding that you need to have empathy, that you need to be in a vulnerable place internally, that you need to really get immersed in something that you've never known or understood before, and that those people and that community are assets and experts and knowledge creators and activators with you, I think is really important. The other thing that is really salient here is I think we often look at these populations, whether we're talking about indigenous people or people living in poverty, people of color, from a very, very horrible deficit model, rather than thinking about strengths, assets, expertise, incredible knowledge that's there. Who gets to decide who's in this movement, right? And who cares about it and gets to sit at the table? So questions matter, how you approach people matters, and building really meaningful partnerships. If you're sitting around a table and you're surrounded with people who are just like you, there's no way that you're going to understand the complexity and entirety of this situation.
But I want to stay with this whole idea, this who gets to tell the story, because our whole premise here is that to be a good leader, you have to be a good communicator. To be a good communicator, you have to be a storyteller, whether you're a filmmaker, a journalist, a college president, a scientist, you name it, right? The whole idea of who gets to tell the story. So are you suggesting that I might not be able to tell the story of the indigenous person living near the land and being affected by climate change? Should I not do that? Or can I do that? And therefore I need to think in a bigger, different way. What exactly are you suggesting here?
Yeah, I think that's the right question. Honestly, I think sometimes no, you shouldn't be the person telling the story.
But if I'm not the person to tell the story, what if there's no one who will tell it or can?
Well, I think there are plenty of people who can. It's a question of finding who they are and having partnerships that are genuine, that are authentic, that allows someone to feel empowered to share parts of who they are, of their lived experience with you as a partner, rather than someone who feels like an object or a trophy, or really, something that's diluted to something that's not. And I'm not implying that you would do this, but people who go in and sometimes think about communities like this, if you're coming at it from a deficit lens. But if you are, in fact, and just to be clear, I do think that there are plenty of spaces where you could be a storyteller. And this, myself included, I talk about our students. I share what I'm learning as a president, but I'm also a woman of color. I don't have the experiences of some other students on my campus, just as an example. But when I'm telling those stories, first, they have to be real. They have to come from a place of genuine knowledge and empathy and connection. And I have to have the permission and respect, right, to really feel like I can do that and be a vehicle for that, which I think is a really important part of being able to do it. It can't be made up, and you have to live it. You have to really live in the messiness and the vulnerability that allows you to tell a story in its complexity and its realness, that is about really respecting the person that you're sharing with the world.
You told me in a conversation we had not long ago that people of color don't trust people who are working on climate and in sustainability. That's a big statement. And I'm wondering what you think needs to change that, and how people gathered here watching our conversation right now who are committed to this issue can contribute to that.
To be clear, I think there are varying opinions in communities of color, right? Whether we're talking about Black, Indigenous, folks of color all around the country. But I think generally speaking, there has been historically a mistrust. There has been this sense of that's what that group does. And we get affected, but we're not empowered to tell our story, to be part of movements. We're not seen as experts. We're not seen as people who are interested in this topic when we absolutely are and we care. It might show up in a completely different way when your basic human needs are not being met and you're living in an environment where you clearly are being affected by something so enormous, yet you're kind of a pawn in the middle of something rather than someone who's an agent of change. So I guess I would urge folks listening in to go back to my example of how do you move things from the periphery to the center? If you're going to talk about climate change, sustainability, you have to talk about social justice and integrate all these intersections of identity. You know, that water issues are universal human issues. Urban ecology for young brown and Black folks living in cities being deeply impacted by this, and rural communities, of course, that we integrate those things into the language of what we're doing, and that you really don't accept that you can have a conversation or a group if it's actually not mixed with the very people who are being affected by this. And many people would argue, oh, that's really hard to do. We can't find those people. I resist that beyond, as far as I can, because there are incredible, talented people all over the place. The questions and how we build those partnerships need to shift so that we're not looking at those individuals as if we're studying them or they're doing us a favor or we're trying to understand pathology, but rather introducing ourselves to saying, you're a partner. This is meaningful. This is important to all of us. So I think the way you tell stories and how you approach those things really, really matter. Do the work.
Do the work, bring the voices in, make sure we give authorship and agency to those who have the stories to tell. Well, President Collado, thank you so much for your time. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think a lot to incorporate into the narratives that we need and that we tell as we go forward. So thanks, and good luck to you on your institutional change at Ithaca and beyond.
Thanks, Frank. Thanks for having me. This has been such a great opportunity, and I'm so inspired by what Planet Forward is doing, and very excited about the students and what they'll do.
Well, thank you. We look forward to more.
Hi, and welcome. I'm Dan Reed. I'm Executive Director of Planet Forward, and I'm your host for the second half of the show. Frank Sesno, he'll be back with us next week for the third installment of the Planet Forward Summit series. Stay tuned. Today, I will announce at the end of this program a very special guest that will be joining us next week. Next week, we have an interview with the Chief Sustainability Officer at Comcast NBC Universal. For now, we're going to continue the conversation here, the powerful conversation we've had with President Collado just a second ago that Frank had with her, really looking at this issue of how do we implement institutional change. As we know, Tempe, Arizona, and the southwest parts of the United States have faced serious climate challenges, including drought, extreme heat, and it's getting worse. From the private liberal arts school we just heard from at Ithaca to ASU, schools and institutions are reimagining ways to solve the challenges that confront humanity. So with us today, we have Steven Beschloss. He's the Senior Director of Narrative Development and a Professor of Practice at the Julianne Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. And we have two students, Haley Campbell, she's from Texas, pursuing a master's degree in sustainability solutions at the School of Sustainability at ASU, as well as William Walker, a junior, studying sustainability and urban planning. Welcome. Steven, let me start with you. Tell us, how is ASU trying to affect meaningful institutional change?
Thank you, Dan, and thanks for inviting for me and our students to participate in the conversation today. And one of the things picking up from the conversation that Frank had with Shirley just before this was this idea of disruption, and messiness and complexity. And that's something that ASU has taken seriously, and that really takes the form of believing that the notion of what is elite, what is the most sort of respected and valuable institution often comes from who do we exclude, not who do we include, and then how do they actually succeed. So at ASU, there's a very fundamental notion. It's really a mission of the university, which is about access, excellence, impact. And it really follows this notion that the more that we can include the diverse socioeconomic, racial, ethnic makeup of our society, the better off we as an institution will be to take the benefit of having this sort of diverse perspectives and insights and experiences that come along with that, but also to be able to pursue the needs of the society, which are, of course, to be able to educate as sort of the full sort of makeup of our society, and to represent it. So in the last year, the incoming class was almost 50% minority students. That's something that we take, with great pride, because what it does, it sort of opens up the opportunity not only for those students to have the experience of going through sort of 4 years of college and achieving their dreams and the opportunities for mobility that come along with that, but also the opportunity for the university to benefit from all their ideas and perspectives and insights.
Yeah, I mean, I love President Collado talking about healthy disruption. The Global Futures Lab is a new element of what the School of Sustainability is doing. Can you give us a little bit of insight on it?
Sure. So it really dates back to 2004, 2005, when the university launched the School of Sustainability. At that time, there was no other school like it in the country. That's grown over the last decade, now I guess almost 15 years. And there was a recognition that we had reached a point where we needed to take the next level. We needed to take the next step. And so the Global Futures Laboratory sort of represents our belief that while sustainability and environmental focus is part of it, it's also social, political, economic. It's sort of the full sort of diversity of the society and our world, both in terms of the physical systems of the planet, but also the social systems that we humans have created as a part of that sort of full system. And so there's a very specific goal, which is to be able to, looking forward to the future, to be able to create a habitable, livable planet that actually increases well-being. And part of that, it's right in the name. It's global in the thinking, and it's futures. It's not future. It's not one future, but it's many futures. It's this idea of the we of that future is going to require the input of and the insights of a full diversity of our world, both within the university. And the whole range of kind of intellectual realms across the university, but also in the larger society, the many futures that we're all in our different ways trying to pursue.
Yeah, speaking of futures, in our case here, let me turn to William for just a second. We talked about this a little bit yesterday, but you're trying to amplify voices, and in particular around your work with urban conservation and urban heat island effect. Tell me about what you're doing at ASU.
Yeah, sure, definitely. So I work at ASU as a student worker in the School of Sustainability. For the past year, I've been working as a communications aide. So this looks like managing this website platform called Sustainability Connect, which is a site full of student and faculty projects and internships. And another segment of that position is working in the realm of communications like social media and writing student and faculty success stories. So I've really taken that position and rebranded it to focus a lot on writing and a lot on storytelling, because I think it's so amazing to highlight the contributions of students, staff, and faculty, because everyone's doing such amazing work and such amazing projects. And I wanted to see how I can highlight that and essentially tell their story and amplify that through publishing, through written word, and give them something just to be proud of, essentially.
William, what's your background as a storyteller? I mean, can you tell us what's motivated you to get into storytelling and developing narrative as part of this?
Yeah, for sure. I think that it's always honestly been a part of my life. I've always been the first one to speak at a presentation, the first one to open my mouth in class. I'm always talking. I have a background in writing. I'm very passionate about that. And I'd say that those are some of the elements that have led to this. And the way that I really start with that is just by writing out all my ideas and essentially just talking to people, because that's all that is. And storytelling can take so many different mediums as well. Like, it doesn't just have to be through conversation. It doesn't have to be through writing. It can be through visualization and any other medium out there. It can be through art.
Haley, you're from Texas. We've seen some pretty serious extreme weather events and climate challenges in Texas in the last few years. You're at Arizona State University now, pursuing a master's degree as well as part of your sustainability studies. Tell us a little bit about what you're doing at ASU and what you hope to do through storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me today here.
Great background, by the way.
Yeah. So at ASU, kind of my background in storytelling is very similar to William's. I love talking. Anybody who knows me knows that I can talk for hours on end. And I just love telling stories, even if it's just about my day. I love to hear it all. And I encourage people in my community to do the same. I am the one to always ask questions and really listen in and hone in on people's experiences. And I think that's a really important part of just learning, but also just being a person. And so that's kind of my background in storytelling. But what I'm doing at ASU right now, something interesting is for my program as a master's student, we have a capstone project. And for that, I am working with an organization called the Local 2030 Islands Network. And this network is a network of islands from around the world who are working together to share knowledge and stories and experiences to create locally informed, culturally relevant solutions to the climate challenges that they face. And specifically for me in this project, it's kind of going back to what we just heard about. It's about meeting people where they're at and expanding the conversation to islanders and their stories of climate action, and using their experiences to develop a shared sustainability development platform and framework to enable these really vulnerable populations to emerge out of the climate disasters that are facing their communities.
The Local 2030 Islands Network, I mean, these are islands that are specifically being challenged by climate, sea level rise. Some of the folks have nowhere to go. In your work there, what's the next step? What's the next step for you, both, I suppose, as a student, but also your leadership on Local 2030, and what do you hope to impact with it?
Yeah, so I'm working with a team of students, and our next step now is to interview a bunch of the different island leaders to understand their perspectives and what matters to them. Because, I live in the heat of the desert. My biggest concern here is extreme heat. For them, it's rising sea levels and the fact that they might have their home get taken away, which doesn't just hurt them now, it hurts their future generations and their culture. Their culture is really tied to their land. And so I can't possibly understand that from where I'm at in Arizona. And it's these conversations and these stories that we're hoping to listen and learn from to develop this future framework that other islands can adapt their stories and experiences to create a sustainable future so that they can adapt to these climate change impacts to the best of their ability.
Steven, there's something that compels me here about ASU. Certainly we have the School of Sustainability, we have the Global Futures Lab, and you've been leading some of the effort here in higher ed on this, whether it's been research or practice. But you have baked in narratives as a school and storytelling into what ASU is doing on sustainability. And we see it reflected in your students. Why?
So if you look at the problem we have with the climate crisis, we haven't solved it yet. That's the first thing. And so why not? So there's a whole complex of reasons, but one of them, which surely speaks to me, is the failure of the communication thus far. And so we have had the benefit of scientists and data analysts and others to be able to share their insights. That's obviously affected some people and it's affected policy. But it hasn't necessarily changed the minds that we need to change ultimately to be able to not only influence thinking, but change behavior and ultimately, and maybe first, recognize the urgency. And so there's been a notion that you have all these brilliant people who are working together, and I'm thinking about academics and I'm thinking about students, but they're always and often trained in a rather narrow way in terms of their academic disciplines. And so the challenge is, and the opportunity is to get people to think more about narrative, to think more about storytelling as a way to begin to communicate with a much wider audience, and therefore have the opportunity to have more engagement and ultimately more impact.
Yeah, President Collado introduced a few of those narratives: race, power, justice, resistance. William, Haley, I wonder how those themes fit into some of the stories you've told. And I'll start with you, William.
Yeah, well, so just being in the School of Sustainability, being in an environmental field as a Black person, sometimes it can just like feel very alienating. So I feel like I've always had an opportunity, and through ASU and through other organizations, an actual platform in academia and many other different sectors, just to tell that story and tell my experiences. And gladly, everyone's been very receptive of it and has been giving me the resources to do so. Like, I've written stories even like about myself and my position, about my experiences in sustainability and how you can amplify organizations and initiatives such as Black Lives Matter for a sustainable future. I've always made a case to just like always amplify the stories of others. And of course, without co-opting it, but just saying this person has this narrative and this perspective, and this is something that you should be considering. And honestly, just thinking about more than just myself and everyone else. The School of Sustainability and sustainability as a whole is something that's very interdisciplinary, and it's a very systems-based approach to environmental issues. And it doesn't just look at one issue. It looks at people, like how are we amplifying and bettering people and the environment and every ecological feature, human and non-human, to be the best version of themselves that they can be. So I'd say that those are some of the ways that I've had to amplify those stories.
Yeah, Haley, let's turn to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And very similar to William, for me, most of my storytelling has been around amplifying other people's voices and trying to understand what their perspective in these situations are. But, for me personally, I grew up in San Antonio, Texas. A majority of that community there is Hispanic, and most of my friends are Hispanic. And so for me, like learning from their perspective and like how the difference is in our perspective of climate change, justice, social issues together has been a really eye-opening experience for me. And the School of Sustainability is giving me the tools to learn how to ask the tough questions and, be vulnerable in these storytelling experiences. And on top of that, the school allows you to kind of write your own story as a student. You have a ton of different classes to choose from, but you also have a ton of different professors who are wanting and to reach out and connect with you. And even the dean, something so unique here is like I can walk down the middle of the campus and the dean will say, "Hey, Haley, what's up? How's it going? And what justice issues are you working on today? How can I support you?" And pretty much everyone in the school is like that. And it's a really awesome community to have the opportunities to share different stories with each other and amplify each other's voices. It's not so much about competition and who's going to get what job after they graduate. It's how can we all work together. And I think that's really important, especially with recognizing the different justice issues we have, is how can we collaboratively work together to understand the faults and the issues and the barriers and overcome them together. I think that's a really important thing that the school offers us.
Steven, I think we're seeing it right here. This is the global futures, and we're seeing an example really of healthy disruption. So I'll give you the parting thought. What's next for the Global Futures Laboratory? Planet Forward and ASU have a partnership as well. We're co-producing content for our Peril and Promise series as part of PBS, but can you give us a preview?
Well, I would just say, just sort of following both William and Haley, is that empathy is something that's at the heart of what we're trying to do. I think that storytelling gets us closer to not only understanding the crises that we're facing, but also how we can better understand what others are facing and see how their problems are our problems. And so there's quite a number of projects that we're working on that are global in nature, that are trying to sort of pull in lots of different communities. We've got a big project related to sort of indigenous communities, for example, and indigenous knowledge. We do a lot of interesting work in biodiversity right now, and well, it's so many projects. 13 focal areas that you can look at and sort of see the full sort of range of thinking and project work that's going on. But the sort of, the bottom line of all of this is exactly this sort of sense that we're all in this together, and how do we actually work together. So working with Planet Forward and you and Frank Sesno, it's fundamental as an expression of how joining forces, building partnerships and alliances is sort of the secret that's going to allow us both sort of locally, regionally, globally to be able to make a difference.
Yeah, here to meaningful partnerships. Stephen, Haley, William, thank you so much for your time today and joining the virtual summit.
Thank you so much, Dan.
Well, let's take a look at Arizona's neighbor, California. As we've seen through extended droughts, increasing wildfires, climate change makes existing environmental challenges worse. Wildfires in the state just since 2017 have led to millions of acres of forest that needs to be restored. Luckily, we have Matt Hill, who started One Tree Planted in 2014 with a pretty simple mission to make it simple for people to give back to the environment by planting trees. He calls himself the chief environmental evangelist at One Tree Planted. He's a father and a nature lover. Matt wants to make sure future generations can enjoy the great outdoors. His project leads reforestation efforts in the United States and beyond.
California is a biodiversity hotspot, one of 35 on planet Earth.
Here in California, we're subject to the changing climate like everyone in the world. There are some regions where there's been a very distinct shift.
We've seen huge fires that are out of control, and people are very scared of it.
But these forests, they evolved over thousands of years with fire.
For about 1,000 generations, Native Americans managed these forests.
Down in the meadow where you found me and grow.
In around 1849, Europeans flooded California, managing the landscape in a different way.
Black smoke billows from a flame is white as snow.
We started to see centuries-old fire practices suppressed. There's a large fuel load that hasn't been dealt with.
And the result of that is what we see today.
Further north in Sonoma County, conditions are even worse, forcing 200,000 evacuations.
Over 30,000 acres burned, only 10% contained.
Fires on both sides of the highways.
Today, we're at the cusp of change. We're learning how to fix some of the mistakes of the past and how to prepare for the future.
Powerful storytelling there, Matt. Let's dig in if we can. I'll see you pop up here in just a second on screen. There you are. How are you?
We're good. Great. Yourself?
Good. Where are you today?
I'm in Montreal.
Montreal.
Yeah.
Tell us, what's the One Tree Planted mission?
It's simple. We plant trees.
It's a great, simple mission. And so where are the locations that you're seeing the most impact right now and that you're having the most impact as an organization?
We plant in North America, South America, Asia, and Africa. And I'd probably say it's pretty evenly distributed in terms of where we're working. I think our biggest project right now is in Australia from the bushfires, where we're planting over 25 million trees there.
Wow. 25 million?
Yeah.
How do you measure?
Measuring, we look at outcomes. So when we're planting trees here, it might help with soil quality, water quality, might be helping restore, the local biodiversity or creation of jobs. So there's a lot of factors that we look at when we're going in, and not one project is, in a sense, the same. We're doing a lot through Tennessee, Kentucky, and it's been a lot of degraded land from the mining over the years. So, a lot of opportunities to just help there and then bring back the soil so it could be used for other purposes. Again, so many great stories.
And how does technology fit into how you measure? I mean, it seems to me there's plenty of new ways to maybe measure and see how you're having this change and this effect, perhaps through geospatial and other types of technologies.
So we're beta testing some projects right now with like Google Earth, but it's way more sophisticated, looking at carbon capture, soil quality, even biodiversity aspects that's bringing back biodiversity. But, in Australia, there's a great organization called Dendra, where they're using drones to not only also deal with reforestation, but really accurate sensing and hard to access areas on these large restoration projects. And then in Indonesia as well. So we're beta testing a lot of the satellite technology that's out there so we could get the 0.5 meter resolution and look at the health of the forest, what is coming back versus having to get on a plane and go deep into the forest. But for the first couple of years, it's really boots on the ground that will go and look at random plot checks and use their, tablets or phones to capture data.
Yeah. How did you get involved in this? Did I believe had a business background and then got into this, but what's motivating you?
My undergrad was in political science, so I took a lot of environmental classes way back in the day and was exposed to the importance. And then, so I've always been interested in it, and I went the kind of finance entrepreneurial route, but I started a sustainable food packaging company, built that in Canada, got a lot of stuff in the Winter Olympics, and there was always pushback from companies on price points. But they would always tell me, we wish we could do more. And in my back pocket, I'd always say, you can do more, plant trees. People don't realize how important trees are to the environment, air quality, water quality, biodiversity, creation of jobs, carbon, health. And then a big company said, Matt, that's a great idea. You should start that. And I knew people and businesses wanted to help the environment, but they just didn't know where to go about. And if you do, you Google it, you look. And a lot of the organizations out there, I found that information was too technical and information overload, where we've kind of grown a lot by keeping it very simple. And I just use the term pretty pictures.
Well, let's talk about pretty pictures. As a company, you have really embedded, if you will, storytelling as part of the business model. How do you do that?
I said I would build this on building the brand and building the brand through storytelling, because people just don't realize the impact and these great people that are being helped. Like, I'll give you one example, but the Pacific Northwest, we're planting 1.5 million trees through that corridor for California, Oregon, Washington State. And the reason for these trees is to cool the water temperatures and clean the water. Mm-hmm. The reason behind that is so that the Chinook salmon can come back to spawn, because the ultimate goal is the resident orca whale, which is the icon to the Pacific Northwest, is on the endangered species list. Only 75 of them left. And when they did the research, they realized a big part of it was their food supply chain. So by us giving this financial contribution to about 70 different watersheds through this corridor, it's allowing them to put the trees in these critical areas to bring back the Chinook salmon.
Wow. So we see the interconnectivity there. By the way, if you have a question for Matt, go ahead and pop them in the chat and we'll make sure it gets asked. For the Planet Forward Summit, you've committed to plant a tree for every attendee who joins. Where will those trees be planted?
We were talking about California. I mean, we plant trees all over the world, but I mean, California right now experiencing the worst forest fires ever. California is a complicated state. So that video that you showed, it just shows the state of California, and it's a complex state. It's broken up into 98 different resource conservation districts. There's 6 different seed zones. What's going on in Northern California is different from Southern California, different type of terrain. And they continue to happen, forest fires and drought. So we have to look at doing things differently. We have to tell that story, tell it in a simple way that people could understand. And by putting back the same types of trees in the same critical junctions, or rebuilding the homes in the same materials and stuff, it's that definition of insanity. So we're trying to expose people, saying, hey, we have to do things a little bit differently now. So we have an initiative to plant 1 million oak trees throughout California. I mean, we're doing way more than that, but that's one. And oak trees are more resilient to fire and drought. So we're doing a lot of testing around the world with different types of trees that are withstanding these different changes in climate.
And these are local native species of trees that you're planting in these reforestation efforts?
Yeah. So what we did in British Columbia, when they had the last biggest forest fire ever, they noticed when it hit the cottonwoods and the aspens, the fire dipped. So they asked one tree planted to contribute 200,000 so they could place the order at the nursery quickly to do a test and look at the results. And then they said, without the one tree planted being nimble and fast to execute and get them the trees so they could try, would take years in bureaucracy, provincial, state, whatever funding. So I think we've grown a lot, keeping the message simple, the storytelling about all these amazing impacts that are being, having around the world. So we've grown a lot.
It's amazing. So we have an awesome audience of young people here joining the webinar from colleges across the country. How can we get involved?
I'm just seeing the last one from a panelist in terms of Colorado. As soon as I jump on this, we're doing this huge restoration project in Colorado, big pine beetle epidemic, et cetera. But how can people get involved? You know, to me as a charity, it's never been about donate, we need money, and it's gloom and doom. If you don't donate today, the world's going to end. It's more about inspiring people, showing, look, together we can make a big difference. Together we're planting a forest. You can go out and volunteer with your local watersheds that are out there. They're often very underfunded, limited resources, but invasive tree species removal or pruning, trimming of trees, et cetera. And then people can do at school, like fundraisers, and have posters at their school and talk about, hey, here's the 6 pillars about reforestation, how they're like carbon sinks, can really take in a lot of carbon, educating people. So I always say education, awareness, and engagement. Get your hands in the ground, realize, how much this makes an impact. So, I'd be more than happy to provide some assets to you that you could share with all the listeners here today in terms of things they can do. But it shouldn't be just about money. There's a lot of work that's needed out there, and it's all local.
Yeah. Well, we can't thank you enough for your support of the summit this year. And just to tease, we have a One Tree Planted breakout session that will follow this webinar today. So join a couple of One Tree Planted storytellers and learn how they are telling stories about reforestation. Great opportunity. Matt, thank you.
My pleasure. Glad to be here.
It's time to feature some more of our amazing students, I think. So while each of these students have made their mark sharing stories on our website, planetforward.org, they also have insight into how universities and other institutions can drive change. So let me introduce you now to Greta Hardy-Mittell. She's a sophomore at Carleton College in Minnesota. She's also a current Planet Forward correspondent, and she was one of our StoryFest winners from 2020. Greta is devoted to telling stories about the environment and how we can prevent the climate crisis. Welcome, Greta. We're also joined by Diego Mendoza. He's a journalism senior participating in the Global Bachelor's program at George Washington University, our home, which means he's also spent significant time in Asia as part of that program prior to the pandemic. His focus is on business reporting with an eye specifically on green economics. So welcome as well, Diego. And Vicki Deng, a Reed College student. She's a past Planet Forward correspondent, a 2019 StoryFest winner. So she traveled with me and the team to the Galapagos Islands with Lindblad Expeditions, our sponsor. And she's also a biochemist and a molecular biologist, one who's intent on connecting the divide between science and the general public. Welcome. I'd like to start with Greta. So Greta, you're in Minnesota. You were our StoryFest winner from this past year. Let's talk about really thinking about how your storytelling is addressing some of these challenges we heard earlier from President Collado and throughout the program.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Dan, and Planet Forward. I'm really excited to be here and talk with Vicki and Diego today. I'm currently working on a story about an institutional change here at Carleton College called the Green to Go container program. I have a Green to Go container right here. They are reusable containers that are currently being implemented in our dining halls and our cafes around campus to reduce the disposable waste. And it was implemented by a number of students who looked at it and said, hey, we need reusable containers. And then especially with the COVID crisis, as people started taking their food to go more often, we need to have a way to not do that with disposable containers. So that's a really exciting story that I'm looking at and an example of institutional change from the bottom up.
Yeah, I was going to say that. I mean, it really seems like it's a student-led movement that's led to some of this institutional change. Let's go over to Vicki for a second. Vicki, you were also a StoryFest winner. You're committed to storytelling and connecting science and the general public. You're an alumnus now of Reed College in Oregon, but tell us what you're up to.
Yeah, well, currently I am working in a lab in San Francisco that studies more of molecular evolution. So study kind of where we came from, giving a really broad perspective and just relevance to where we stand in the planet throughout its history.
And Diego, you're in Washington, D.C. We're online here at George Washington University for the semester, but you interned with us over the summer. Tell us about some of the stories you wrote with planetforward.org this summer.
Sure. So the first one I focused on was comparing how EV markets have done particularly well given the COVID pandemic. And a lot of that has been because of both supply and demand initiatives that were brought on by governments in Europe and in Asia that were able to essentially keep the markets up through the pandemic. And actually, in fact, in Europe, they're actually booming right now. A lot of initiatives, especially by countries, giving incentives towards the people to both purchase vehicles and giving companies to the incentive to produce more electric vehicles has made it a particularly successful market despite the global recession that is taking place this year. And the other story that I was focusing on was the development of high-speed rail in the United States. I mean, you mentioned I lived in Asia, and I'm a huge transit nerd, so I was using public transportation there all the time, but more importantly, high-speed rail. And I was really interested in exploring what different stakeholders and what different companies are investing and producing into developing high-speed rail in the United States. And so I looked at both publicly led efforts, but specifically that one in California that is taking place and is expected to launch within the next decade, and then different private efforts in Texas, Florida, and Nevada that are leading the way through high-speed rail in the United States.
Yeah. Just thinking about your careers as storytellers here and covering topics like institutional change, what are some of the ways you've successfully captured that narrative and been able to elevate some voices in this movement? And I'll start with you, Greta.
That's a big question. But I'm thinking about an article that I wrote last year about another institutional change at Carleton in the development of a geothermal program to heat our campus. It's now in its final stages. We're turning off this big smokestack that we've had here for like 100 years just this term. And I was able to go in and look at that project and talk to the people who have been involved with it, really get into the nitty-gritties of the science of how that geothermal project works and also the process of implementing it through our sustainability office. And I hope to dive into more stories like that, like the Green to Go, and then also looking in the future at racial justice at Carleton. Currently, that's another big institutional change that we're grappling with. Over the summer, as you know, I'm in Minnesota, which is the hotspot of the uprisings over the summer protesting George Floyd and Breonna Taylor's murders. And Carleton students have really responded to that and pushed our institution to do more, led by the Ujamaa Collective, which is a newly formed group of Black student organizations. So I hope to be able to amplify their voices and the work that they're doing in future stories.
Yeah. Vicki, you've been able to travel with us to the Galapagos. And when you find yourself in a new place, or at least a place that might be a little unfamiliar, how do you go about approaching that story? And specifically, I'm thinking in your case, from a scientist's perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. Yeah, as a scientist in our field, we view things very critically. We even with like peer review papers and accepted things, we like to really question it and make sure that everything is valid. And so when approaching things and new things, unfamiliar things, my approach is to really dig in and really investigate and really go about like the history and the broad big idea of things and making sure that I am capturing like the whole picture instead of just one piece of biased information.
Yeah. Diego, let's talk about that, about capturing the whole picture. You were born in Mexico City, your family immigrated here. Tell us how you approach that as a storyteller, and both, I think, in your voice, but also as a reporter. How do you listen and capture that story and then convey it?
You know, I really pride myself about being an immigrant to the United States and eventually becoming a naturalized United States citizen. I think that, I mean, my family and I escaped both an unstable political and economic situation, and we followed the American dream, and I was able to achieve everything that, you know, so many people in this country strive for. But in doing so, I've also really been exposed to completely different parallels of people experiencing lives that I have never been able to imagine, and people living in squalor and not having access to clean water. And these are issues happening within our country itself. And I think that right now, more than ever, when there is an existential crisis ahead of us, journalists not only have a responsibility to report on these things, it is necessary for them and to point out the players that are causing or prohibiting institutional change from occurring. Because really, at the end of the day, journalists and reporters and storytellers are the people that are giving people the information that they need to make choices. And those choices determine our future. And right now, we need to push ourselves to present stories that will help people understand that climate change is a real crisis, and that we have a responsibility to let the people know that the future of our country depends on who they elect in office and are able to, create institutional change that can give us a generation that we want for our future.
Yeah, we're all about to vote as part of the upcoming election. We are in a time of reckoning with climate action and racial justice, and making sure people from underrepresented backgrounds' voices are not just heard, but part of the leadership group. So when all three of you are thinking about institutional change, what are some of the ways you would like to see institutions lead that, whether it's your college or if it's a bigger institution beyond that? I'll go backwards this time. How about Diego? We'll start with you.
I think there's two things that I think really stood out and that I've noticed from where I've been abroad. And I think one of those, there's education needs to change, and it's particularly in two forms. One, with media literacy. I believe that there's a lot of people out there that don't understand and don't know how to seek out the information that is fact and is explaining the truth about climate change and different environmental issues going on. And I think the other biggest thing that needs to change is our way that we teach our people to have a more collectivist mindset. At the end of the day, this issue is a global issue. It is not an issue that is just affecting people that are going to lose their houses along the sea line. No, at the end of the day, if this doesn't stop, all of us at some point or another are going to be affected by climate change. And so really, when there is a collectivist mindset that is initiated through having more conversations in science class about the effects of this, taking people, bringing in actual people that can talk about their own experiences with climate change situations, whether that's wildfires or losing their homes because of rising sea levels, bringing those people into lead conversations in classrooms. I think that's extremely important. And finally, also engaging people into storytelling with social media out there. I think if people are taught responsible ways to relay information, but also share their own experiences of how they're suffering through experiences of climate change, I think that can really make a difference in our community.
Yeah, I love that. Vicki, I'm thinking about the election here, and we see bumper stickers and signs everywhere. If we had a bumper sticker for you to talk about institutional change, what do you suppose it would say?
I think it should say to listen and to respond. I think institutions more and more these days are able to really bring in diversity, which is amazing. However, that doesn't necessarily lead to the progress we need. I think the institutions need to take in those diversity and really listen to the marginalized voices within that, and really respond to it, because and also like in ways that they feel supported, and these marginalized voices feel empowered to speak out about what they are concerned with. And so I think that is one thing that is really needed to be done, because, I feel like a lot of times diversity in terms of race, socioeconomic class, and all of those things in relation to climate change and environmentalism is really hard for those voices to be heard and then be responded to. And so I think being able to take action with the diverse voice is really important.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Greta, thinking about change on your campus and in your community?
Yeah, I'd like to echo and support everything that Diego and Vicki brought up. And then to add upon it, I think not only do we need diverse voices that are in the conversation, that are being listened to and being responded to, as Vicki said, but also that are in charge. And I think President Collado's presentation really amplified that, that if we want to get climate action done, we need people of color and women and queer people and people with low-income backgrounds. We need them at the head of the table, not just at the table, because they're the people who are being affected by this most, and therefore they're the ones who are going to take action. And like for me as a white woman, I think that it's my responsibility to amplify those stories and also like help those people get in charge and say, maybe there are places where I can help, but I don't have to be at the forefront. I'd like these people to be instead.
Well said. And just thinking about today's program, thinking about global futures and institutional change, I think you wrapped it up perfectly there. The future is bright. So thank you, all three of you, for joining and contributing your stories to planetforward.org. Keep telling and sharing stories that move the planet forward. Thanks.